Hi, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final session of the Darkwater Project's 2022 Colloquium, Historical American Art, Whiteness, and the Idea of the American Nation. This week, we are thinking about historical American art in the context of Tyler Stovall's wonderful book, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, Dr. Stovall's final book. My name is Tyler Green. I am with Dr. Kelly Morgan, the co-founder of the Darkwater Project. I now lead it on my own with the guidance of an advisory board. Dr. Morgan now runs the Curatorial Studies program at Tufts University, a program which she founded. I've written two books about American art, a biography-ish of the great 19th century artist Carlton Watkins, who I argue was the most influential American artist of his time. And I wrote a whiteness studies informed book about Ralph Waldo Emerson, how his study of art led him to write his landmark 1836 book, Nature, and how nature in turn informed the next 100 years of American art. For 12, I think the Modern Art Notes podcast, which I produce and host, entered its 12th year a few days ago. I love doing that show. I'm grateful many of you and many artists continue to come on the program. Before that, I was a journalist and critic. Before that, I was also a journalist, just a different kind of journalist. The Darkwater Project, I mentioned that Dr. Morgan and I co-founded it. It works to create and enable an anti-racist American art history by revealing and interrogating historical American art's role in the construction of white supremacy. Core to Darkwater's focus is that art has had impacts on the nation. Darkwater specifically focuses on American art produced throughout the long 19th century, from the Boston Massacre into the 1930s, kind of through the Harlem Renaissance. Darkwater does this work by working to bring ideas from fields such as whiteness studies, genocide studies, and citizenship studies into the study of historical American art. Here's a quick look at where we're going today. While this is on the screen, I'll note that because the listenership and viewership for these sessions has been running several hundred times higher in podcast and video form, I will be reading the Stovall quotes that will run across your screen. I hope that won't be too much. I've worked to improve my reading out loud skills, not that anybody is signing me up for audiobooks. Tyler Stovall's White Freedom. In virtually every chapter, Stovall emphasizes the role cultural prediction, political and legal constructions of freedom. We've seen this before across this colloquium, including in books beyond our chosen six, such as Rogers Smith's Civic Ideals. Historian after historian has pointed to the key role cultural production plays in developing a nation's political and legal constructs. Boy, Tyler Stovall's book does that even more than any of the others we've talked about. Stovall's book examines how constructions of freedom, primarily in the US and France, were closely related to the immediately subsequent construction of whiteness. Writes Stovall, a belief in freedom developed in the context of increasing racial differentiation. This study, his book, will explore, for example, how the first represented a reaction to the second, and also how the two phenomena interacted and even mutually reinforced each other. Stovall's thesis is that racialization and freedom are related, that freedom and liberty were constructed as racialized ideas, as concepts that white people created for white people and only white people. Belief in freedom, Stovall writes, specifically in one's entitlement to freedom, was a key component of white supremacy. In societies governed by racial hierarchy, the whiter one was, the more free one was. Stovall also explains how freedom and racialization dovetailed with the Jackson-era expansion of democracy for white men in the United States. Across the book, Stovall explains why we should consider freedom, racialization, and the expansion of democracy together as a conjoined process, As he writes, most fascinating is thus not just the denial of voting rights to free Blacks, but the fact that it occurred at the same time as the progressive enfranchisement of white men without regard to wealth or property qualifications. What explains such a curious parallel history? As the free Black population grew, the possibility that they could not only vote, but play a decisive role in elections became throughout the book. Stovall points to how the stories white America has told itself are explained by Stovall's conjoining of these processes into what he defines as white freedom, such as here. Quote, the paradox of American slaveholders fighting for liberty is not a paradox at all if one considers the racial dimensions of the American idea of freedom during the Revolutionary period and after. Denying freedom to Black slaves was not a contradiction, because freedom was reserved for whites. The same principle helps explain how the American Revolution could further the conquest of Native American lands and the dispossession of America's indigenous peoples, who as non-whites did not have the wherewithal to build and profit from a modern free society. Key to the history of the American Revolution was the fact that freedom for whites meant slavery for Blacks and defeat and genocide for Native Americans. Only an ideology of freedom grounded in racial superiority could make this possible. Throughout the book, Stovall points to how art and culture a scholar of modern French history, colonialism, and liberty movements. And French art historians have done a lot of work over the decades on how French art was involved in French national projects. We have here a picture I took just a couple months ago at the beginning of the Smithsonian American Art Museum's reinstallation of its collection galleries. I'm sure all of you know Sam's building and that there are several ways to enter it and even more ways to move through it. So identifying a beginning is no sure thing, but this is kind of where chronologically things begin. Writes Stovall, the symbolic role played by the Statue of Liberty in allowing European immigrants to the US to claim white status affirms its racial character, as does its complicated but largely exclusionary or at best irrelevant relationship to African Americans and other peoples of color. The Statue of Liberty embodies both racial difference as well as an unparalleled representation of human liberation. It is thus the perfect symbol of white freedom. Stovall devotes an entire chapter to the Statue of Liberty. He notes that the Statue of Liberty descends from Mary Ann, the French female personification of liberty, equality, and, ironically enough, fraternity, and that the United States does not really exactly have anything like a Mary Ann figure. In making this observation, Stovall points to Delacroix's first significant Mary Ann, specifically his 1826 Greece on the Ruins of Missolonghi. Stovall points to how specifically tied to the construction of whiteness Delacroix's painting is. Delacroix made the picture in recognition of the Greeks' then ongoing war of independence against the Ottoman Empire. Stovall notes that this painting not only features a white woman, but a Black warrior, one might say a menacing Black warrior behind her. And Stovall notes that this is a reference to the white slavery narrative that we talked about a few sessions ago. Stovall notes that Delacroix is tying Greek freedom to a fear of white slavery, to the potential rape of a white woman by a Black man, all of it racializing liberty all the more. I would note that Delacroix scholars have typically gone even further, noting how Delacroix's first Mary Ann is a secularized Mary. Note the blue robe, the white dress, and her pose, which is taken from the pose early Christians took while praying, a pose which continues in Christian art through a number of Annunciation paintings. And of course, as I'm sure you all have already thought of, this Delacroix leads directly to liberty leading the people. Back to the question of the United States lacking a Mary Ann. Just as Delacroix made Greece on the Ruins in support of a foreign liberty movement that he and other French intellectuals understood as being motivated by France, in 1848, Hiram Powers made a sculpture as American intellectuals were rallying in support of a foreign liberty movement, this one in Italy. That sculpture is America. The only marble version of America was destroyed in a fire in 1865. It survives in a plaster model at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Powers made America in the hopes that the US government would buy it and install it in the US Capitol. That did not happen. Powers made a second version, another version, a bust of Liberty. I think he made 24 editions of it. As is so often the case, I'm using the image from the Met because their fantastic digital department makes a ton of stuff available under open content and high quality too. As Christianity was to Delacroix, the guiding font of American republicanism, Rome, was for Powers. Note that he drapes his America figure in Rome-recalling garments. And note that Powers' figure is a European-American woman using the history and language of Europe to present the United States, a multiracial nation that had for years allowed and pursued violence against non-European people as a state policy and priority, and he's offering this figure as an inspiration to Europe. And of course, it's interesting that given that this is about when the industrial age new imperialism explodes, perhaps maybe not in quite the way Powers intended, Europe really did understand the US example. I've shown another image of Powers' America here, this one made by the photographer and artist Ken Gonzalez-Day in 2014. He portrays America, Powers' America, from the side of America, if you will, which is America turning her back to much of America. Of course, American artists most engaged and extended celebrations of republicanism, not in allegorical figures, a la European artists, but in Emersonian landscape paintings and photographs. As I keep mentioning, I wrote a book about that, and we've talked about it here previously, so we're not going to do it again today. But there is a pre-Emerson painting I would like to raise in the context of Stovall's observation about the Jacksonian expansion of democracy, paralleling the rise in racialization, again, paralleling the growth of America's free Black population. This is John Lewis Crimmel's Election Day in Philadelphia from 1815. So that's about a decade before Jacksonian populism emerges. Crimmel shows a huge crowd of white male voters and some women too. As you surely know, there are 3 Black figures in the picture. I want to focus on the one to the left of center. The Black man wearing a yellow apron, serving food to the men who are participating in and celebrating the election. Remember, in 1815, Pennsylvania's Constitution did not discriminate for the purposes of voting. Certain Black men could vote just as certain white men could vote. Still, Crimmel's Black man is not participating in democracy. He's simply serving those who do. With that figure in mind, let's zip through the Jacksonian era to the 1850s and to one of the most famous paintings of the American 19th century, George Caleb Bingham's The County Election at the St. Louis Art Museum. This is the first of 2 versions of the picture, and by first, I mean earliest. At the far left of Bingham's picture, Bingham reprises Crimmel's yellow apron wearing Black serving figure. I should note that Bingham lived in Philadelphia for 3 years in the early 1840s. He left Missouri to study at PAFA. The Crimmel painting was known through prints, I think by 1819, was spectacularly popular. It continued to be produced in print form into the 1890s. I think it's entirely reasonable to consider that Bingham couldn't have missed it. We might consider Bingham as having noticed, by the way, one other thing, Nancy Rash's excellent 1991 book on Bingham and his politics, his political career, joining his art to his political career, does not mention this figure. We might consider But it does provide lots of other information on other things Bingham is doing in this painting. I don't mean that in any disrespect to the book. It's hugely valuable, and I own it and reread big parts of it in preparing for today. We might consider Bingham as having noticed a fundamental inconsistency within the American project and approving of it. In reprising the central Black figure in the criminal and duplicating his role within another Election Day scene, all with striking sameness, Bingham is saying that the place of the Black figure in the 1815 criminal is just fine for 1852 America. American democracy is for white people. Freedom is white. I'll add two more things on this painting really quickly. One, Missouri itself did not allow Black voting in 1852. And I would also add that I don't think that would have mattered to Bingham. He wrote several times about how for him this was a nationalized scene. He was not intending to portray a specific or individual state. He was addressing the nation. And in fact, I think we kind of see that back here in the very rear, where he's eager to point to how America is a Westering country. As we consider the 1850s, and we should, especially now, we should remember that the key question among liberal elites of the period is whether Black men and women had the inherent capacity to participate in self-government. I think each and every author we've discussed in these 6 sessions has hammered away at the importance of this question. If there's one thing I take from these books in aggregate, it is the importance of that question to the formation of whiteness. Again, in Bingham's maintenance, if you will, of the criminal, he provides an answer, whether it is Bingham's answer or 1852 America's answer is for another time. Among the artists who engaged the question of Black futurity, particularly within the American project with special intensity, and I'd argue particular artistic success, is William Wetmore Story. The most famous white artwork addressing Black futurity is Story's The Libyan Sibyl. There's no question it's doing such because Story tells us so. We have here an excerpt from a letter Story wrote to Charles Eliot Norton, who would go on to become the first professor of art history in the United States at Harvard University, indeed the first university professor of art history outside of Germany. Writes Story, she, the Sibyl, is looking out of her Black eyes into futurity and sees the terrible fate of her race. This is the theme of the figure, slavery on the horizon, and I made her head as melancholy and severe as possible, not at all shirking the real African type. Story is using a figure from the classical past to look forward from the classical past. It's an engagement with the American present, but a timid and I think preliminary engagement. The much more interesting and complicated, at least to me, engagement is Story's masterpiece, Cleopatra. Before we talk about it, let's understand the context in which Story is producing it. And for that, let's turn to Tyler Stovall, who writes, quote, "Freedom easily coexisted with slavery and empire in 19th century Europe and America, as long as it was defined in racial terms as white freedom. The realities of racial discrimination coexisted with the alluring prospect of an egalitarian multiracial freedom. In the United States considered many addresses of this paradox and whether an egalitarian multiracial freedom was indeed possible. Proposed addresses of this question considered in the United States in those years in the early 19th century included the expulsion of Black people from the United States in pursuit of a racial pure or white republic, colonization, and the allegedly liberal question, do Black people have the inherent capacity to participate in American republicanism? I think Story's Great Cleopatra is his engagement with that question. It's a sculpture in which he does what he did best, use the classical past to address the American present. I think that if we understand a few things, including one, what Story said he was interested in at this time, two, the contemporary American discourse around race, as most recently defined by a blockbuster and hugely popular new book. 3, stories to key art historical sources. And 4, if we join all of that to what a key story amanuensis wrote, and of course the sculpture itself, then story's subject, I think, reveals itself. One more thing, Story's biography is somewhat important here. William Wetmore Story is the son of Joseph Story, leading American jurist, Supreme Court justice, in fact, the Supreme Court justice who is the key link betwixt the John Marshall and Roger Taney Supreme Courts. Story's father, Joseph, was involved in, or wrote, every important citizenship court decision for 40 years before dying in 1845. And just before William Wetmore Story left Boston for Rome, William Wetmore Story edited a volume of his father's writings and published it. And of course, many of those writings were about citizenship. Story was born to these issues, and he seemed to know it. So let's start from the most obvious place, from the place most of the scholarship on this sculpture starts, and perhaps too much of it ends, the question of Cleopatra's ancestry. Europeans and Americans were fascinated by Cleopatra's race or ethnicity, and in the case of Europeans had been since at least the 14th century, when Boccaccio wrote about Cleopatra as, quote, an Egyptian woman. In the mid-19th century, Cleopatra was widely understood to have had an African mother, and that thus Cleopatra was Black. Despite Cleopatra having been widely considered to have been African and Black, artists needed to fit her into the European construction of beauty in order for the stories they wanted to tell about her, stories they believed to be rooted in historical fact, to make sense. So they portray her as white, really white. A bunch of examples of this here. I'll go through them really quickly. Famous Guido Reni, in which Cleopatra has kind of notably creamy skin. Tiepolo made a whole bunch of Cleopatra paintings, many of them focusing around this banquet with Mark Antony. In most or all of these pictures, Cleo is bordered by not only Black men, against which her skin is all the whiter, but Mark Antony is himself darker skinned than Cleopatra, calling more of our attention to her white skin. That's even clearer in this studio picture at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh, part of their brand new, just opened a couple weeks ago, collection installation, which I enjoyed a lot. Sure looks to me like they've cleaned the painting too. Then there are these two paintings. The Jerome at left features something I'm leaving out of the narrative today, but is very much there, and that is that for white intellectuals in Europe and in the United States, Black people were very often described as and compared to animals. In the United States, the most notorious carrier of such address is Thomas Jefferson, I believe in his notes on the state of Virginia. And here in this painting, in this print after Mengs, a painting which I believe no longer exists, Cleopatra is extra whitened by a mysterious perfect spotlight. Contrast these portrayals by artists with the then contemporary transatlantic discourse around defining race. That discourse was being led, or at least co-led, by someone we've already met, old friend Samuel George Morton. After Morton wrote Crania Americana, which we discussed a few weeks ago, he wrote this book, Crania Aegyptica, a shorter book in which Morton uses his pseudoscientific cranial measurements to argue that many Egyptians, basically the lower working classes and slaves, were Negroes, and that the ruling class was Caucasian. These are, of course, Morton's words. The book was well received in the United States, especially in the South, and most especially in Charleston, the intellectual capital of the antebellum South, where it motivated much of the Southern defense of enslavement from the mid-1840s on. Morton continued his research and then died before what he could write, or at least publish what he imagined as his magnum opus. Two of his friends and collaborators, Josiah Knott and George Glidden, who was the former US consul to Egypt, who supplied many of the skulls, if not almost all of the skulls, Morton used to write Crania Egyptica. They teamed up with Louis Agassiz and published in 1854 the book Types of Mankind, among the most notorious books of the American 19th century, and one read widely in Europe, not just here. Despite being fantastically expensive, an unbound copy of Types of Mankind cost $12, which was about 2 weeks' wages for a working man at the time. Types sold 3,500 copies in its first 4 months, and then even with Civil War paper shortages, it went through 10 editions in 17 years. Purposes, I'm just going to note that Knott and Glidden followed Blumenbach's and Morton's lead in constructing the ideal of white beauty with an artwork, the Apollo Belvedere. Note that Glidden, an amateur or semi-pro Egyptologist, presents there as being 4 different colors of Egyptians: red, yellow, black, and white. Note how Glidden includes among his examples of Caucasians who are heroic and historic types, Cleopatra herself. The debate about Cleopatra's ancestry, accepting the needs of painters, had been pretty much settled since Boccaccio, but was being reopened. Indeed, Story himself will contribute to the discourse not only with his sculpture, but with a poem he wrote titled Cleopatra. That poem includes references to white beauty ideals that include a white bird, a cockatoo, as a stand-in for Cleopatra. In both sculpture and poetry, Story is mindfully playing on the question of Cleopatra's racialized ancestry. For Story to address the United States in Cleopatra the sculpture, he needed 2 things. He needed his Cleopatra to be black, and recognizably black, but still to fit within racist European beauty constructs. That ambiguity was useful to him in another way because he's using Cleopatra to ask a question. Story previously told us how he did this with the Sibyl, and he does it again here. Briefly, he is presenting Cleopatra's facial features in a way that will read to a contemporary European and European American as being fuller than a white woman's, her body as being more muscular and defined, and her breasts as being larger than a white woman's. I mean, comparing it here with a contemporary sculpture, Sappho, that's at the MFA Boston. It too is a story, of course. The racializing and racist roots of all of this have been well explored by scholars, both of art and not, in many contexts. And I'm sure most or all of you are familiar with that work, so I'm going to skip it here. In case Story's audience might miss it, Story activated his network of Boston elites to make clear what he's doing, that he needs his Cleopatra to help him make sure his Cleopatra is enough red as black. Among those Boston elites is Edward Everett Hale, an old friend of mine from my work on Thomas Starr King and Yosemite. Edward Everett Hale and Thomas Starr King were best friends. Edward Everett Hale was, along with Frederick Law Olmsted, one of the 2 finalists for the job of running the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. Hale did not get the gig. He left for Europe. Hale was a Boston Unitarian minister who was very close to second-generation transcendentalist circles, and he was a leading editor and critic in publications such as the North American Review, which was a Unitarian pub, and the Atlantic Monthly, which was secular and nationally famous. Hale was traveling in Europe just as Story finished Cleopatra, and he writes about it in an account of his travels that was published almost immediately in 1861. Note the first part of Hale's quote here, which of course he wrote after seeing Story and Cleopatra in Rome. Writes Hale, "A line of Egyptian mothers for 10 generations have made her wholly Egyptian. In this raving hot blood of her, in this passionate temper, and in the whole quality even of her mind. It was no pretty Greek beauty that worked such havoc with such men as those, being Caesar and Mark Antony and Augustus. You are looking, my dear friend, on an African queen, the first since Sesostris to hold sway over the conquered heroes of Europe. and her sway is broken now, and Europe is thundering at the gates of her citadel. Next, I think Story builds from recent art history to emphasize that he's engaging with an ambiguity, a question. He has just frozen up. I think I'm back. Let me cover that last part again in case my screen frees up. Impacted everybody. Story, I think, is asking a question, and that the question is about the present, that the question is contemporary to the conception and production of his sculpture Cleopatra. He does that by riffing on two sculptures. The first one was a 20-minute walk from his studio, the famed Agrippina of lore at the Capitoline Museums. And the next is one of the most famous and controversial sculptures of the 19th century, Canova's portrait of Letizia Bonaparte, the mother of Napoleon, a sculpture known as Madame Mère. We don't know if Story saw the Canova, but it trafficked mightily in print and photographic culture of the mid-19th century, such as here. Story's era was unsure whether the Agrippina, the sculpture, portrayed Agrippina the Elder or Agrippina the Younger. So Canova was unsure too. But Canova used that uncertainty by making a sculpture for which the key point was that both Agrippinas were mothers of notorious murderous sons who became emperor, namely Nero and Caligula. Canova's embrace of or wielding of the ambiguity about who was represented in the Capitoline sculpture is what allowed him to coyly make the real subject of his sculpture Letizia's notorious son, Napoleon. I also should note that Canova's sculpture was mightily criticized in its own time for too directly riffing on Agrippina. So Story would have known that. In his use, and what I argue was his use of these two sculptures, he would have been mindful not to hew as closely to the Agrippina or the as Canova did, or he was closely to Canova. So Canova is using a historical figure to address a contemporary issue or question. American sculptors loved to do this too, especially Story. And like Canova, Story embraces an ambiguity from art and antiquity to ask a question about the present. Here's the historical background that Story could have counted on his audience to know. Cleopatra was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. After her death, Egypt was assumed into the post-Republican Roman Empire. If Cleopatra, the final ruler in a 3th-century Greek dynasty, was African, if she was Black, the failure of her rule suggested that Blacks lacked the capacity for self-government. If she was European, if she was white, she was a benevolent figure who ruled Africans astride 2 dynasties, Greece and Rome. These are the classical versions of questions with which liberal white Northerners were grappling before and during the Civil War. In many art historical Cleopatras, Cleopatra is a seductress, not here in Story's sculpture. In many art historical Cleopatras, the moment of her death is the subject, the point of drama, such as in the Guido Reni, not here. In others, such as Edmonia Lewis's version, Cleopatra is dead. Nope, Story's Cleopatra is very much alive. She's deep in thought, in fact. Her head is not hanging, not tilted seductively toward Caesar or recoiling in horror at imminent death, but looking out contemplatively. In the LACMA version, which is the first version Story made, there are 4 versions: LACMA, Richmond, the Met, and Atlanta, the High. In the LACMA version of the sculpture, Cleopatra's fingers are held in a tension that suggests she's flicking her fingers like that, as if she's working through, thinking through something. In the Virginia version, Cleopatra's legs, and indeed her body, is somewhat more relaxed. Her hand, too, although she's still flicking a forefinger as if she's thinking through a question, an uncertainty. Given everything from which Story has built her, art history, pseudoscience, the philosophical constructions of whiteness and blackness, Cleopatra's biography and her role in world history, or at least Mediterranean history, as well as the then American present, The question Story is asking seems plain. Can Black men and women be Americans, full citizens? And should white Americans, who had politically and culturally constructed themselves into dominance, welcome Black men and women into the national project? Cleopatra, betwixt white and Black, antiquity and modernity, Africa and Europe, Europe and America, is thinking through the issue, the risk, the problem that Black people such as her represent to a nation remaking itself. Last thing on Cleopatra, back to Edward Everett Hale, writing in 1861, and again, very likely informed by his fellow Brahmin Story. He points us in this very direction. Let's look at the second part of that quote I shared earlier. You have the same old story of Africa, Hale writes, always outwitted by Asia, always outfought by Europe, as you look on in despair. Outwitted and outfought. These were the issues at the heart of the racist question about whether Black men had the inherent capacity to participate in self-government. Did they have the right stuff? Were they smart enough? Were they brave enough to fight, to defend or expand republicanism? Hale makes it pretty clear. The last story I want to share today is one that I hope reinforces my core argument that culture, specifically historical American art, has been crucial to the construction of whiteness and white supremacy in the United States, and that we, as historians and art historians, should investigate that history and share it with our audiences, especially because white supremacy and its impacts remain with us today. This is the United States Pension Bureau building, today the National Building Museum, a trade industry, building construction industry promotion venue. The Pension Bureau building became necessary in the 1870s, for reasons we'll talk about in a moment, and was built in the 1880s. It was constructed as an intermediate fulfillment of gratitude from the United States to the Union soldiers who had fought in the Civil War and to their families as well. It is an immense building, nearly a quarter mile around. To understand why it was necessary, in 1860, received about 300 petitions for Army or Navy pensions each year. 1 year, 300 petitions. In 1865, the final year of the Civil War, the Pension Bureau received 75,000 petitions and would receive 70,000 some odd new petitions in each year for the remainder of the 19th century. One reason was because Congress kept expanding who was eligible for a pension. Widows, families, and such. By the late 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, I should say, Civil War pensions made up 1/4 of the federal budget. It made this building a real source of political power for the ruling party. Designer Montgomery Meigs, who we've met before, based his pension building on the Palazzo Farnese in Rome, and then hired a Bohemian American artist who will become extremely well known for his design of monuments honoring Union soldiers. His name was Caspar Buberl, and Meigs charged him with making an appropriate artwork for this building. Buberl made a 1,200-foot-long that wraps around the entire building. It is well above eye level. As you walk around the pension building, you're looking up pretty good. It is an extraordinary frieze. I had seen it many times, but did not really study it until several months ago. As you walk around the building and look at the frieze, it dawns on you that these aren't just soldiers. These aren't only sailors, but they are pointedly not at war. They are pointedly not traveling between battles. Everybody in this frieze is on his way home. He made it. He served the great 19th century conflagration. As I walked around the building back in July, I got quite emotional a couple times. I kept thinking about how I had to have a grandfather I never met who couldn't have been in this line, who didn't come home from World War II. Buberl created this massive 1,200-foot long frieze by making 28 different scenes that were then joined and mixed and repeated all the way around, with one or two exceptions. Note that the men are helping each other home. They are weary, they are battered, they are injured, but they've made it. They aren't stopping, they aren't pausing, they are going home. There are 1,300 figures in Boobrel's frieze. 1,299 of them, all but one, are soldiers and sailors. In a very closely related story, 1,299 of them are European Americans. There is one black figure in Boobrel's frieze. He is pointedly, intentionally not a soldier. 200,000 black men fought in the Union Army or Navy during the Civil War. Black soldiers and sailors made up 10% of Union forces, and they would make up over 9% of the soldiers who filed for pensions. Boobrel and Meigs absented them from this building that was constructed to fulfill a nation's promises to the soldiers who fought for it. I should also note Boobrel made sure we understood that this man was not a soldier. He is a mere teamster, which Boobrel points us to by including the words supply train on the wagon he is pulling. Boobrel and Meigs absented black men, black soldiers and sailors from the building constructed to fulfill a nation's promises to the soldiers who fought for it. Historians and curators must recognize absence and what it means, as much as we focus on presence and what it means. I want to conclude this colloquium in the place we started it, with a personal story of family and its relationship to the history of white supremacy in the United States. This time it isn't my family's story, it's a story presented by the artist Lava Thomas. In an exhibition that's now at the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art and that originated at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Art, Thomas introduces us to her great-great-great-grandfather, Charles Arthur. After fighting for the Union and in an astonishing number of theaters in the Civil War, it took 8 years for Arthur to prove he deserved his Army pension. Or at least the government made it take 8 years for him to prove he deserved his Army pension. Across her series Decatur, named from the town in which Arthur passed away, across the series Decatur, in this portrait and in related works, we'll see in just a moment, Thomas tells Arthur's story, the story Boobrel and Meigs excluded from the US government story. Thomas shows us how Arthur refused to perpetuate the name of his enslaver and how he instead took the name Charles Arthur. This was not uncommon. How Arthur demonstrated in affidavits and service records that he had earned his pension. I'm going to show just a couple of these. I think there are 16, 15 Thomas pictures detailing Arthur's service record. And still the nation from the Interior Department's Pension Bureau. So these documents were processed in the building we were just looking at. Maintained the fiction within Boobrel's frieze and denied Arthur his pension for 8 long years. I should note this was not an unusual story. There has been an enormous amount of scholarship done in the last half century on the disparities in pension fulfillments and speediness, if that's a word, for Black soldiers and sailors and white soldiers and sailors. I don't share Thomas's work to suggest that the work of historical America, I don't share Thomas's or Ken Gonzalez-Day's work to suggest that the work of historical Americanists is to show past addressing contemporary work such as theirs. Contemporary curators should do that, absolutely. I share Thomas's work because it advances a narrative that our field has more often than not ignored. As historians, maybe that's a little harsh, but as historians, our work is to investigate, to interrogate, to join artists such as Gonzalez-Day and Thomas. Our field and our institutions must hold up our end of the work. To fail to do so fails to support artists we admire. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that the work Darkwater does, and hopes to do with many of you, is strikingly traditional. It is the work that some of the earliest constructions of the fields of art history and museum practice proposed that we do. Take, for example, what Johann Gottfried Herder wrote at the end of the 18th century. and indeed after the French Revolution. Herder is writing in opposition to Enlightenment attempts to wall off the study of aesthetics from art's engagement with and influence on ideology, politics, and nation. Writes Herder, we come to know nations far more intimately than we can through the misleading and pathetic method of studying their political history. From this latter kind of history, we rarely learn about a people, we rarely learn more about a people than how it was ruled and how it was wiped out. From its poetry, and of course he's using poetry in the Romantic era sense here, in which poetry stands in for all the arts. From its poetry, we learn about its way of thinking, its desires and wants, the ways it rejoiced, and the way it was guided either by its principles or its inclinations. Attempts to wall off art history, and indeed museums, from investigating and presenting how art shows a nation's way of thinking, its desires and wants, and how it was guided, are strong in a present dominated by political and institutional conservatism and economic neoliberalism, especially in a field such as this one that was substantially created by the art market and that has walked hand in hand with commerce ever since. In his recent book, A History of Art History, it's really a history of Western art history, Christopher Wood writes about the tendency of art history as a discipline to narrow and to cover up complication. He writes about how art history tends to elevate the ideal and offers an argument for why. The circling around the ideal is sustained by formal citations, Wood writes. Alternative art histories, what I might call revisionist art histories, disturb this dream from the outside, threatening the citational closure. Everyone closes ranks around the idea of decorous art, as if in conspiracy against indecorous pasts. Resist that tendency. Investigate and share the truth about art and the work it has done within the United States. Thanks for joining for these 6 weeks. People have questions. I will do my level best to answer them.
Can I ask a question, Tyler?
Yes, you bet. Hi, Anna. Let me see if I can. Oh, maybe you've already done it. Great. I think people can hear you.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. I took the
power. All
right. So I wondered if you, since you've been looking around and thinking about this subject, if you've seen any particularly good examples of curators, museums looking to historic art and doing the kind of work that you're talking about, looking critically at the historic objects with historic objects without contemporary art?
I think there are some places that have done a wonderful job of welcoming in artists. I think of the current show at the Wadsworth with Darkwater Advisory panelist Stephanie Sihuko. But in terms of addressing American history with art and other material from America's past, I haven't really seen a lot of that. And I think that's something we all need to try to do. One of the things I don't have a slide of it, which maybe I should, but Kelly Morgan and I came up with a list of about 10 or 12 core Darkwater practices. And one of them is it focuses on recognizing the value and power of answering the constructions of whiteness and white supremacy with contemporary to those constructions examples of Black people or Native people or Asian Americans or Chinese in the context of the Chinese exclusion era, doing things, making things, writing things that belie the narrative that the dominant white majority was constructing. And I think those are practices that we don't see in our museum institutions. In just the period that we've been doing this colloquium, By far the most common comment I've gotten on phone calls and in emails is not just curators, but academics who say, you know, we weren't taught to do that. We weren't taught to bring in Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia and show it next to Cleopatra, you know, one as being in discourse with the other. And I think that's something we need to do. Objects have power. Showing powerful objects of one kind, books, prints, especially when those books, like Types of Mankind, use art to make their argument, is impactful and meaningful. In the chat, Erica Holmquist Wall writes, Princeton University Art Museum is currently circulating a traveling exhibition called Object Lessons, American Art from the Museum that recontextualizes American art history for the present moment. And she believes it opens at the Georgia Museum of Art next February before traveling to the Speed in the fall. I knew that was coming. I'm looking forward to seeing it. Anna, does that kind of get at or engage?
Yeah, I guess, you know, I'm trying to think it through. As you know, I'm trying to think it through in my own practices. And I think we do some of that in our current exhibition, Making American Artists. But I'm also trying to think, you know, your lectures are so text dependent, and I'm trying to think about visitors and how much text they want to read. And I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to think about the best way to do this visually for many people. And especially those, like, you know, those 19th century sculptures, which you do such a good job of placing them in their moment and how people would understand them in their moment. And it's a lot to unpack for people to gain access to all of that today in a non-lecture, non-classroom, non-discussion based format. So it is often successful when you bring what I did with Making American Artists is bringing different art from different periods. So not necessarily contemporary, but it might put something from the 1940s next to something from the 1770s, and that can promote discussion. So I'm just, you know, trying to figure out best practices for those monumental marbles and how to open them up in a way that doesn't require tons of reading, which we might be okay with doing, but not everybody is.
So I think about this a lot because I've been working on a story project. We all love practices, but sometimes we've just got to start and focus on expanding exhibition practice to begin with, and walk in the dark toward best practices. Expanding our usual practices is a challenge, and not overwhelming people with text is certainly something to have in mind. You know, no installation reaches and lands with 100% of an audience. So thinking about everybody, welcoming textual engagements is, never going to happen. I have lots of, I have more Cleopatra material on my computer than you would humanly believe possible, including Palmolive advertisements. And there's a little tube of stuff about that big in mini museum collections called Cleopatra face powder. And what it is it's the 19th century material that made blackface. And so sometimes the objects are so clear and so direct in what they're doing and in what they're saying and in the narrative they're telling that maybe we don't need as much text as we think. I will admit I'm a guy who has dropped a 574-page book on the world. So I'm probably being a little text heavy in in these sessions. But I think it can be done. I think it can be done in partnership with good exhibition designers. I think it can be done, well, let me put it another way. I think it must be tried. Because I think if we're going to tell our audiences about what these artworks are about, we can't just not do it because it's difficult. You know, we've got to find paths. And I think with the stories in particular, perhaps because I've been working on them for a while, I think there are paths. I think on walls, I don't know, my experience, I'm sure it is yours too. On walls, work does a lot more work on its own than work does on slides. So I think we can do that, but yes, I think there are some questions about text. On the other hand, maybe a little bit more text is good because these are complicated issues, and we need to not be afraid to present them clearly and directly.
I also think Aaron's point about material culture is fantastic. And
could I read that for a quick moment? Aaron Monroe from the Wadsworth writes in the chat, we being the Wadsworth Athenaeum, hi Aaron, have found success in expanding narratives through the inclusion of material culture, archival documents of imagery, and inserting quotes or primary sources that offer an alternative perspective. Sorry for interrupting, Anna.
No, that's all I was going to say. And I think the most successful exhibitions I've seen from an exhibition perspective or a curatorial perspective are often exhibitions that take a deep dive into a single object. Like I know that we at the AHA conference, Janine Morimoto Bolt presented on something she's doing on a Thomas Ball sculpture. We talked about the show at the Met, you know, interestingly, another sculpture. You know, I think I talked for many years about, you know, how one could do a show just about Penn's treaty with the Indians, our painting, which can be unpacked and explicated and unpacked and, you know, like, but I think our institutions have to be willing to take those deep dives. And sometimes that's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point in two ways. One, good directors have to do the work of not just showing up at a board meeting with an exhibition proposal that's almost complete. They have to engage their boards with what is the work that needs to be done and how to do it at a more holistic level, including having you know, anti-racist art historians in to talk to their boards about why this is the work of art history and the institution. Secondly, you know, one of the things Kelly and I wrote into Darkwater's strategic plan, something that, you know, isn't immediately possible, but I hope will be in partnership with funders, is it gets to that value of single work excavation and how we would love to, when Kelly was with me, we would love to partner with institutions to develop institutions and foundations to develop, say, a 1,000 square foot gallery within their collection galleries, 800 square foot, whatever, whereby one artwork was addressed from the approaches that Darkwater takes. And such an address would include not only the artwork in the museum's collection, but would take advantage of local archival collections, such as special collections at the nearby university library. And of course, some museums have rich special collections of 19th century material within their own buildings, right? And how that would fulfill, that kind of an approach would do lots of things at once. Good art history, reveal a single artwork and what it's about in an intensive and interrogative way. Have a rotating exhibition, and we know people in the corner suites love that. But also that it would provide art museums to more completely fulfill their role as leading institutions in their communities by working with alike but not identical institutions. such as historical societies, universities, university libraries, and special collections, all of which would do the work of pointing to how art belongs in discourse with the other material and intellectual engagement of the time of its making. That is an approach I nerd out on a lot. Maybe that comes a little bit from, I think Kelly's got reasons she likes that idea too. But like, I think for me, it comes from, I worked on a book about a photographer, and I spent years sitting in library special collections as carts of cool stuff went by. So I liked seeing that cool stuff everybody was working on, and came to think that putting all that together could be really effective. Other questions? Last call for questions before we wrap up. I should note before closing, as with all the other sessions, this will be up on YouTube no later than Monday. And this will go out, the audio from today will go out on the Modern Art Notes podcast feed on Monday afternoon around 4 or 5 p.m. Eastern time. As ever, encourage y'all to share it with anybody in your orbits. The downloads for the podcast only version have been hovering around 10,000 a session, which for something as nerdy as discussing the fingers in William Wetmore Story's Cleopatra seems pretty amazing to me. And if nobody has any more questions, thank you for joining. Thank you, and thank you for participating.
Thanks, Tyler.